After the end of the Second World War, the world was divided into two camps: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the socialist East, under the leadership of the USSR, the successor of which is modern Russia. Between them unfolded not only an ideological, but also a technological battle for military supremacy, the so-called arms race. The dangerous and tense dynamics of mutual deterrence kept the world on the brink of nuclear catastrophe for decades. Each new development by one side prompted a response from the other. What if Soviet counterintelligence had been feeding disinformation to American military engineers for several years? Could it be possible that the USSR was meticulously concealing a secret project, the power of which is difficult to overestimate even now? And could one person, while remaining in the shadows, influence the course of military actions? This story is not just an episode from Espionage Chronicles. It is a carefully planned and still shrouded in mystery operation codenamed Zagadka 2, Russian for Riddle. It was developed and executed by the KGB, the Committee for State Security of the USSR. It was not written about in newspapers. It is not in history textbooks, but it became an important tool in the invisible struggle of the intelligence services of the two superpowers. Despite the fact that official KGB archives remain largely closed, information about this operation surfaces in declassified documents, memoirs of former employees, and independent investigations by historians. Who was behind all this? How did they manage to deceive the best counterintelligence agents of the West? Why does this operation continue to intrigue historians and analysts? And what ordinary-looking train gave the world no peace, neither day nor night? These are the questions we will try to unravel. What is espionage? Precisely, it is the act of obtaining secrets from the enemy, the foundation of any confrontation, often competition. Whether it's a large industrial enterprise or simply a neighbor's kitchen where a clever recipe might be learned by hiding under a window. Not to mention military matters where information about the enemy's plans was more valuable than gold, for the price was human lives and the fate of an entire country. Can you imagine how strategically important productions and technologies were guarded, and what role military intelligence played in this process? Let's glance into the not-so-distant past, the late 1960s of the 20th century. A fierce confrontation begins between the two powerful states, the USSR and the USA. The Americans are leading for the time being, as they have precise strategic nuclear missiles in their arsenal. Dark clouds of danger are gathering over the Soviet Union's military facilities. What should be done? How to protect the country from nuclear catastrophe and prepare to give a worthy response? As usual, the Russians approached this problem with their characteristic ingenuity. What if they simply attempted to deceive the US targeting system, hiding their missiles so the opponents could not find them, while the USSR always had them at the ready? A secret decree was issued to create the combat railway missile complex. So, a command post with 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles is loaded onto a train and sent rolling across the country. It sounds like a scenario from a spy movie, but it is much more dangerous than it might appear. After all, there were armoured trains, not to mention other trains carrying weapons. Rumours say that the idea for creating such a train was suggested to the Russians by the Americans themselves, who launched disinformation about completing the development of a mobile missile complex. Why did they need this? In the Pentagon, they understood that creating such a train was unrealistic, merely a waste of time and effort, but more importantly, a huge financial burden. They could not have imagined that the Russians would bring the fairy tale to life, and soon such a train, designated as Number 0, would appear on Soviet roads, becoming the first of its kind in the world. To outward appearances, it was an ordinary, unremarkable freight train. Thousands like this travel along the railways of the vast country. Identifying which one contains the sly payload, a missile with a range of over 10,000 kilometers, is not only difficult but essentially impossible. One nuclear missile is quite enough to cause irreparable damage to any state within minutes. Upon learning about this development, the United States made a decision. Something had to be done. How would you act if you were in the position of American intelligence? It's clear that one would start looking for all possible ways to detect the ghost train, and even better, find a person well informed about it. But where to find him? Digging through their archives, the CIA suddenly discovered documents on military engineer Viktor Buterin. He was an ideal candidate for espionage participation, and crucially, he worked as an engineer at a factory manufacturing parts for ballistic missile engines. Needless to say, this factory was secret and located in a closed city. Did you know that closed cities existed in the USSR? No, they weren't settlements fenced with high walls and 3 rows of barbed wire. They were regular Soviet cities, but foreigners were not allowed because major industrial defense enterprises, military warehouses, or bases were located there. However, there were also super-secret localities that could not even be found on maps, and they were named with numbers: Artemis 16, Sverdlovsk 45, Tomsk 7, Tashkent 90. They were constructed at a respectful distance from national borders with a special regime in place. The importance of state secrets was understood even by children. In these cities, various nuclear, biological, and even space research was conducted under strict secrecy. How did the ordinary population live in closed cities? In general, quite well. The store shelves offered goods that were just dreams in other cities, with salaries augmented by an additional 20%. One could leisurely walk the streets of such a city even at night, and leave apartment doors unlocked. There was almost no crime. But such security had to be paid for with silence. Those who could not keep their tongues in check and spoke of their remarkable town faced severe punishment. Imagine how these invisible cities enticed foreign intelligence agents. They were prepared to do anything to obtain information. Just think back to 1985 and the incident with the railway container, which, according to documents, contained crates with handmade decorative flower pots. The cargo was being shipped from Japan to West Germany, swiftly transited via the Trans-Siberian Railway across the Soviet country. As it later turned out, this was not an ordinary container with harmless goods. It was a wondrous laboratory with cutting-edge equipment capable of detecting nuclear objects and photographing areas the train travelled through. Soviet counterintelligence agents uncovered the foreign intelligence's cunning plan and intercepted this train. However, Western intelligence agents occasionally managed to infiltrate these closed cities. How did they do it? On entirely legal grounds, as diplomats in foreign delegations. Although very rarely Moscow granted permission for such excursions. That's when the intelligence agents used special equipment for air sampling and detecting radiation levels. Yet all this proved ineffective and unreliable. Soviet services were also vigilant. They quickly identified the spy and expelled them from the city. Constant information sources were needed, and that could only be a person working at a top-secret facility. But to recruit such a person, one had to somehow gain access to the city. Attempts were made. Through relatives, through acquaintances. Why was Western intelligence interested in Buterin? Was it only because of his residence and work in the secret city? As it became known, Viktor's relative, a certain Klesnikov, held a rather important position in the Soviet Ministry of Railways, which meant he had access to documents coordinating the movement of railway trains, carrying military equipment from enterprises to military units and training grounds. But most importantly, Klesnikov couldn't help but be aware of the existence of train number 0, its route schemes and stops. Buterin and Klesnikov were absolutely necessary for the CIA. How easy is it to make a person betray their motherland? Let's not idealize humanity. Some could be bought with money, others with an idea. Most, of course, refused, but American intelligence knew many ways to make a person strike a deal with them. From ordinary blackmail and threats to the use of physical force or specially developed drugs. Which of these methods would they choose for Viktor Buterin? As it turned out, there was little need to exert significant pressure on him. Carefully studying Viktor's biography, American counterintelligence stumbled upon a very unpleasant episode from his past that he had meticulously hidden from the KGB. Had the Soviet authorities learned about it, execution would have been unavoidable. What do you think is the most important aspect of a spy or intelligence officer's work? Correct. Remaining inconspicuous to those around them, blending seamlessly into the general crowd. No hats or dark glasses covering half of the face. Get rid of the long coat as well, as all of these only attract attention. And a newspaper with a hole to observe what's going on around is something straight out of spy novels. It's much simpler in reality. A foreign intelligence agent is a grey and unremarkable person who easily gets lost in a crowd. Such an agent also appeared in our story, Moscow, July of 1969. The evening hustle and bustle at Nikitsky Gate Square. No one pays attention to the person with a magazine in their hands, calmly looking over cinema posters. A few minutes later, a stranger approaches, shuffles nearby, and then turns to ask, "Do you happen to know where one can watch a film of Eugene Onegin?" "Onegin is best listened to at the Bolshoi Theatre," came the reply. As you've already guessed, this was the password, just like the magazine in hand. It was held by Viktor Buterin. It was with him that Frank Smith, the deputy head of the CIA's Moscow station, made contact. Their meeting lasted no more than a couple of minutes, but in that short time, Smith managed to subtly hand Viktor Buterin a note with further guidance on their cooperation. A special package was prepared for Viktor. The sign of readiness to pick it up was a chalk line drawn on one of the buildings in Moscow. In a telephone booth on Rustaveli Street, there was a concealed stash with a secret container holding money, special invisible ink, a list of topics of interest to the CIA, and postcards of Moscow signed by tourists. These were cover letters. What were these letters needed for? Of course, for transmitting the information received. A foreign tourist strolls through Moscow, wishing to share their impressions with family. How to achieve this? Mobile phones were still in the realm of science fiction at the time, yet there were beautiful postcards. Sign one and send it home. Let them admire the views and read the message. The Americans figured out how to use this to their advantage. Buterin was supposed to inscribe information expected of him in invisible ink between the lines on such postcards and send them to the address already written on them. He received new instructions each month. Why was the CIA so confident that Buterin and his relative Klesnikov would cooperate and not run straight to the KGB? It all came down to a secret that these individuals were meticulously hiding. What compromising information had the CIA uncovered? I would say it was truly a damaging dossier. If it fell into the hands of the KGB, it would spell the end of Buterin and Klesnikov's careers and peaceful lives. It turns out that during World War II, both collaborated with the intelligence services of Nazi Germany. It must be added that at that time, the Soviet Union's KGB was working very effectively. A large division was tasked with hunting down World War II traitors, achieving considerable success in this direction. Many war criminals were found and all received the punishment they deserved. Some were even executed. The CIA had no doubts not only money but also fear would compel Buterin to become a traitor. But how did a simple engineer become a significant figure in this dangerous game? What was his role in a large-scale military operation? Before the onset of World War II, Buterin worked in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in one of the laboratories. In the year 1941, when he was just over 30 years old, he was drafted and, after training, was deployed behind enemy lines. However, very soon, he was captured by the Germans. After severe interrogations and psychological pressure from the enemy, Viktor agreed to become their agent. Following his training at an elite school of German military intelligence, he was dispatched into the Soviet rear. Yet Buterin had no intention of becoming a traitor and immediately reported his recruitment to Soviet counterintelligence. What is a military radio game? It is a well-planned operation where an agent with a radio set is first identified in the rear and then persuaded to switch sides. Soviet counterintelligence was among the best in conducting such games. Throughout the war years, they carried out around 200 such operations, neutralizing hundreds of enemy spies. Carefully selected disinformation was sent westward, and new spies were detected. Buterin was also decided to be used in such a radio game named Zagadka. The task of the operation was clear: to deliver disinformation to the highest levels of German intelligence and possibly even lure some German spies into the Moscow region. Once Victor told the Germans about his relative Klesnikov, whose position allowed him access to very important strategic information, more precisely, plans for the movement of military equipment and personnel, which also indicated upcoming maneuvers at the front. The Germans thoroughly checked the information and, confirming that Klesnikov indeed held a high-ranking position, gave the task to recruit him. The Germans had two main objectives: to obtain secret information from a high-ranking official and, if possible, to eliminate Stalin. Incidentally, they decided to recruit Victor's relative on behalf of the Americans, rightly understanding that, knowing Germany's true standing at that time, he would hardly agree to collaborate with them. Soon, Buterin informed the Nazis that he had managed to persuade his relative to share important information with them. But in return, he wanted a large sum in dollars and a US passport. The Germans agreed, and in the spring received a message that a secret plan detailing troop movements over the coming months had fallen into Klesnikov's hands, and he was ready to hand over these documents. Germany was delighted and sent an agent into the Soviet rear, but he was immediately captured and sentenced to execution. However, it turned out that the German intelligence agent survived, ending up in a prisoner of war camp, threatening to disrupt a global military operation in the future. The enemies failed to retrieve the documents, and Victor reported that a decisive Russian strike was expected in the southern sector of the front during the summer. As you might have guessed, it was a strategic deception. When Soviet troops advanced on the Central Front and in Belarus in June of the year 1944, the German command was in shock. They weren't expecting them there. The Germans, having suffered tremendous losses, retreated, and the Soviet army found itself in Europe. The last radio message from the Germans was received on the 5th of April in the year 1945. Afterward, they had no time for their agents. Incidentally, Germany never discovered that Buterin was a Soviet spy. The war ended, Victor returned as an engineer to the factory, and Operation Zagadka remained only in the memories of counterintelligence officers and in the folders on the dusty shelves of the KGB archives. Who would have known that it would be resumed a quarter of a century later, now involving the United States? Who started playing a cunning game with the CIA? How the American intelligence was led to believe in disinformation. Let us return once again to Moscow in the late autumn of the year 1969. At the post of the first Deputy Chief of Counterintelligence of the KGB, USSR, was Major General Grigory Grigorenko. He would lead the counterintelligence department for 13 years, and this period is rightfully called its golden decade. Grigory Grigorenko was rightly considered a master of radio games with the enemy, combining a principled intellect and subtle intuition with a rare ability to understand and sense the emotional state of another person. Grigorenko instantly understood whom to trust, how to manage an agent, and how to feed the enemy disinformation, minimizing risk. His operations sometimes resembled exquisite psychological performances or chess matches, with the adversary being the best minds of Western intelligence agencies. Grigorenko initiated one of the most risky and intricate operations, Zagadka II, involving a modest Soviet engineer named Viktor Buterin. At that time, no one knew this game would last long and turn out to be far more dangerous than it seemed initially. The year 1970. The first coded message for the CIA from Viktor Buterin. It contained lies mixed with truth. Information that his relative Klesnikov occupied an important position in the Ministry of Railways and details about Buterin's own work at a defense plant in Perm. A combination of real facts and disinformation. That was precisely the plan. To present a pure lie would be easy to verify, but no one intended to disclose all military secrets either. It was a delicate game where Buterin was the bait, intended to mislead the CIA and gain time to create a secret weapon, a combat railway missile complex. Simultaneously, they were collecting information on the activities of American agents on Soviet territory. How Buterin came into the view of American intelligence. There is a version that the CIA was aided by the archives of Heller, a former Wehrmacht general who oversaw intelligence on the Eastern Front. In the spring of 1945, he copied valuable data from German intelligence services, documents, photographs, microfilms, and surrendered to the Americans. In exchange for cooperation, he was offered to create a new intelligence agency in the Federal Republic of Germany, directed against the Soviet Union. Most likely, it was from him that the CIA received information about Buterin. It is possible that this talented intelligence officer, Grigory Grigorenko, was able to predict the moves of enemy intelligence many years in advance. However, the unraveling of this mystery is still kept in the secret departments of the Russian special services. The Americans had no doubt that Buterin would work for them, selling strategic secrets. Fearing exposure, Victor would attempt to leave the Soviet Union, but for that, he needed a substantial amount of money. And where could a simple Soviet engineer find it? What information on military secrets did the CIA receive from Buterin, and how did it aid Soviet engineers? Work on the missile complex was underway in Dnepropetrovsk. The chief designers were the brothers Vladimir and Alexei Utkin. The first worked on the launch vehicle, the second on the launch complex and the cars for the missile train. The task was not an easy one. A typical rail car would not have withstood the missile's weight of nearly 135 tons, and the rails would simply have buckled under such weight. However, Soviet engineers managed to solve these problems, but more on that later. The United States decided not to lag behind the USSR, and in the autumn of the year 1969 began developing a model of their own invisible trains. Naturally, any developments in this area sparked considerable interest. Soviet counterintelligence could not miss such an opportunity, and very soon disinformation mixed with parts of the truth began to flow through Viktor Buterin. The Americans froze in anticipation. Through designated dead drops, Buterin received a camera and a radio receiver tuned to the CIA frequency. He usually received instructions from the center in Munich. The few American operatives in Moscow were tasked with setting up dead drops, handling encryptions, and maintaining the communication channel. The CIA was unaware of how futile their agents' efforts were. The KGB diligently distracted their attention, which was also one of the tasks of Operation Zagadka II. Almost 5 years passed like this. In the mid-1970s, the construction of the secret Soviet Phantom train continued actively. But it was too early to speak of the train's readiness, especially since it was necessary to upgrade the railways by replacing wooden sleepers with concrete ones. It was clear that such large-scale works could not go unnoticed by Western intelligence services. The KGB faced a new question: how to remove spies from the locations where train number 0 was to be tested. Once again, they needed Buterin and his relative Klesnikov. Another wave of disinformation allegedly received from Klesnikov was fed to the Americans, stating that missiles for the nuclear train were ready in a small Siberian town. The CIA deployed its agents there, who attempted to enter the highly secretive, well-guarded city. Meanwhile, in Dnepropetrovsk, new developments were tested without interruption. After this, doubts began to arise within the CIA about whether their agent was playing a double game. They started trusting his reports less, demanding clarification on how they were obtained. Once, they even took an interest in Victor's past. Had the CIA uncovered Zagadka II, or had someone betrayed Buterin? It turned out to be an echo of the first Operation Zagadka. Unexpectedly, a German agent was discovered who had survived a Soviet camp. In the year 1955, a German was granted amnesty in the Soviet Union, returned to the Federal Republic of Germany, and began working at a center in Munich. While reviewing Nazi archives, CIA employees unexpectedly stumbled upon his dossier and discovered that he had worked with Buterin and knew him well. The German was interrogated, and he revealed that he had seen Victor interacting with Russian counterintelligence. A Soviet agent had never come so close to being compromised. So much persistent effort, strength, and time wasted. Of course not. Grigory Grigorenko could not allow this, and once again exhibited his unconventional thinking. In the next radio communication session, Buterin expressed outrage over the CIA's mistrust and stated that the proof of his loyalty would be some ultra-secret information he had managed to obtain. However, he would only hand it over to a resident. The CIA believed him. At the appointed time and designated location, Frank Smith, the deputy CIA resident in Moscow, appeared. He was the very one who had first made contact with Victor 5 years earlier. As soon as Smith received the book with microfilm, he was immediately detained by KGB officers and issued an order to leave the Soviet Union within 48 hours. Operation Zagadka 2 was ready for its logical conclusion, but Grigorenko was not satisfied. Sometime later, in the hall of the Polytechnic Museum in Moscow, one of the Soviet state security employees was addressing an audience. While narrating about the espionage practices of Western countries on Soviet territory, he casually mentioned a recent incident where the KGB detained a Soviet citizen trying to pass sensitive information to American intelligence. The citizen was imprisoned for 8 years, and the foreigner was expelled from the country. Clearly, this was another move by Soviet counterintelligence aimed at removing Viktor Butyrin from the game. With foreigners present in the hall, the CIA learned about this story immediately. But if Butyrin was arrested, he was not a KGB agent. Then who was the traitor? Viktor Butyrin, having changed his passport details and biography, disappeared somewhere in the vast Russian expanse. Only in 2010 would his name be declassified, but his further fate would remain a mystery. What about Klesnikov, a relative of Viktor's? In the summer of 1977, preparations were underway in Paris for the visit of the head of the USSR, Leonid Brezhnev. Among one of the Soviet delegations that arrived in advance was Klesnikov, a representative of the Ministry of Railways. The CIA immediately suspected that he was the very relative of Butyrin, through whom valuable information was conveyed. To establish contact with him, Frank Smith, the same CIA operative expelled from the USSR, arrived from the United States. Smith cautiously engaged Klesnikov in conversation, hinting about a familiar relative. The official frowned but remained silent. When the men were alone, Klesnikov irritably remarked that Butyrin was executing a CIA mission, but ended up in prison due to American mistakes. He then hinted that he was willing to continue the collaboration in exchange for a large sum of foreign currency. Smith agreed, but insisted on having Klesnikov vetted by CIA specialists. Of course, Klesnikov was immediately subjected to a lie detector test, specifically a polygraph. It monitors sweating, breathing, heartbeats, and similar factors. While some people devise more parameters for the polygraph, others find methods to deceive it. A well-trained person finds this quite easy. As you might have guessed, under Klesnikov's guise was a KGB officer. General Grigorenko once again set traps for the Americans. He knew that Butyrin's relative, who helped obtain secret information, would not escape the CIA's close attention. Grigorenko also suspected various checks. For an intelligence officer, a lie detector test is a walk in the park on an autumn day. Therefore, the CIA operatives, having trusted the polygraph, confirmed that Klesnikov had no ties to counterintelligence. Thus, they had the opportunity to receive secret information once again. Consequently, Operation Zagadka 2 continued, and misinformation flowed abundantly straight from the Ministry of Railways. Incidentally, it is still unknown whether there was an actual high-ranking official named Klesnikov, or if this was a mythical figure invented by counterintelligence. Meanwhile, the work on the ghost train progressed. Vladimir Utkin and his colleagues had several problems which were resolved by the year 1982. The first issue was the dimensions of the missile. The carriage with the launching system could not exceed 24 meters in length, but where could one find such a short missile? After long deliberations, they designed a collapsible form, making the nose cone inflatable and the nozzles extendable. Another nuance was how to launch the missile so that both the crew and the train remained intact. They recalled the mortar launch method. Initially, a powder charge ejects the missile, and then at an altitude of 40 meters, the main solid propellant mini-engine is activated by automation. The ghost train consisted of 17 cars. This included 3 cars with launch modules, each carrying 3 missiles equipped with 10 nuclear warheads. These were followed by a command module comprising 7 cars. Separately, there was the primary energy source car, which housed a diesel power station, followed by the radio center car, storage cars, fuel cars, and dormitory cars. The entire train was pulled by 3 locomotives linked together. One such complex equated to a missile regiment. Although externally the train did not significantly differ from a regular freight train, its weight, despite the equipment, did not exceed 2.5 tons, whereas an average freight train sometimes weighed almost 6 tons. Train number 0 could travel 1,000 kilometers in a day, with routes yielding to it everywhere. Ordinary Soviet citizens could not even imagine that passing through their stations was a train capable of wiping half the continents off the face of the Earth. The CIA suspected the existence of the ghost train and even attempted to find it from space using satellites. But how could they detect a train well camouflaged as a regular composition and racing along general-purpose tracks? So how did Operation Zagadka 2 end? For a long time, the CIA received distorted information from Klesnikov, and only after 6 years was it decided to terminate Operation Zagadka 2. Soviet military secrets remained undisclosed. However, Grigory Grigorenko decided to exit the game in style. This occurred in Moscow in May of the year 1983. CIA operative Louis Thomas found a note in his car from Viktor Buterin. Buterin informed that he had been released and demanded payment for his work. Through Klesnikov, the Americans agreed and designated a hiding place for the money. On the 2nd of June 1983, Thomas was apprehended in a Moscow park while attempting to plant a container with 300,000 rubles, an enormous sum at the time, indicating the value of the information received from Buterin. Operation Zagadka 2 indeed concluded impressively, and very soon the planned trials of the nuclear train began. By 1987, 3 such complexes were already traversing Russian roads, which came as an unpleasant surprise to the United States. To counter the new threat, the Pentagon had to deploy an entire network of satellite reconnaissance. Operation Zagadka 2 lasted more than 40 years, and the scale of disinformation that reached the CIA remains classified to this day.